Picture this. You're scrolling through the news one morning and you see a headline that sounds like it came straight from The Onion. President wants to buy Greenland. You laugh. Twitter explodes with memes. Late-night hosts roast it for a week straight. Denmark calls it absurd. The whole world treats it like a billionaire's fever dream. But here's what nobody told you while you were busy making jokes. This isn't the first time. It's not even the second time. The United States has been trying to acquire Greenland for over 150 years. And the reason has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with survival. Today, we're going deep into the most misunderstood real estate deal in modern history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the world's most powerful nation is obsessed with a frozen island most people can't even find on a map. Welcome to the new Cold War, except this time, the ice is literally melting. The visionary who started it all. Let's rewind the clock to 1867. The American Civil War just ended. The country is broke, divided, and barely holding together. And there's this one guy in Washington with an absolutely insane idea. His name is William Seward, Secretary of State. The same man who just convinced Congress to buy Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, a deal critics mockingly called Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. But Seward wasn't done. While everyone was laughing at the Alaska purchase, he was already looking at the next piece on the chessboard, Greenland. He commissioned secret studies. He explored acquisition pathways. His logic was ruthless and brilliant. Control the North Atlantic choke points, dominate Arctic shipping before anyone else realizes its value, project American power into a region that would define the next century. Congress killed the idea. Domestic politics got in the way, but Seward planted a seed that would never die. Truman's $100 million gamble. Fast forward to 1946. World War II just ended. Cities across Europe are still smoking. The Soviet Union is rising, and President Harry Truman is staring at maps that show something terrifying. The next war won't be fought in trenches. It will be fought with bombers flying over the North Pole. Truman understood something most Americans didn't. Geography is destiny, and Greenland sits directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. If Soviet bombers wanted to strike American cities, they'd fly right over Greenland. So Truman did something extraordinary. He made Denmark a formal offer, $100 million in gold bullion, not paper money, not bonds, physical gold. The Joint Chiefs of Staff put it bluntly in declassified documents. Greenland is indispensable to the safety of the United States. Denmark said no, politely but firmly. But America didn't give up. If they couldn't buy the house, they'd rent the most important room. In 1951, a defense agreement gave the U.S. permanent access to Greenland. That agreement still exists today. The historical precedent nobody mentions. Here's the part that makes this even more interesting. Denmark has sold territory to the United States before. In 1917, America bought the Danish West Indies for $25 million in gold. You know them today as the U.S. Virgin Islands. So when people say you can't just buy a country, history says otherwise. The precedent isn't theoretical, it's literal. The GIUK Gap, the gate that guards the Atlantic. Pull up a globe, not a flat map, an actual globe. Now find Greenland. Look at where it sits between North America, Europe, and Russia. See that narrow stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom? That's the GIUK Gap, and it's one of the most strategically important pieces of ocean on planet Earth. Imagine you're a Russian submarine commander. Your mission is simple. Get a nuclear-armed submarine from Arctic bases near Murmansk into the open Atlantic where you can threaten the eastern United States. You have one major problem. You have to squeeze through the GIUK Gap. For NATO, this corridor is a monitored kill zone. It's covered by underwater sensor networks that have been listening for decades, maritime patrol aircraft circling 24/7, satellite surveillance, acoustic tracking systems built during the Cold War and upgraded ever since.
If you control Greenland, you control the western wall of that gate. If Greenland falls under hostile influence, say through Chinese port investments or Russian infrastructure deals, that gate becomes dramatically harder to defend. The unsinkable aircraft carrier. Military strategists have a term for Greenland, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. You can sink a warship, you can disable a carrier battle group, but you cannot sink an island. Greenland provides permanent forward positioning for early warning radar systems, fighter aircraft, refueling stations, missile tracking, and satellite ground stations. And here's where geography becomes brutal mathematics. A ballistic missile launched from Moscow toward Washington, D.C. travels roughly 5,000 miles. Warning time, maybe 30 minutes. From northern Greenland to Moscow, barely 2,000 miles. That compression in distance means compression in reaction time, and in nuclear warfare, seconds save millions of lives. The new submarine race. Here's what should terrify you. Russian submarines are back, and they're better than ever. After the Cold War ended, Russia's submarine force fell apart. Rusting hulls, broken reactors, sailors going unpaid. Not anymore. Russia has rebuilt its submarine force with newer, quieter, and deadlier vessels. They're operating in the North Atlantic at levels not seen since the 1980s. NATO calls it the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic, and Greenland sits at the center of it. Now, imagine if the United States actually owned Greenland. No diplomatic friction over expanding bases, no negotiating with Denmark every time you want to upgrade radar systems, no delays when you need to deploy new missile interceptors. Your smartphone runs on Greenland. Let's talk about what's actually buried under that ice, because this is where the story shifts from military strategy to economic survival. Pull out your phone. Look at it. That device in your hand contains rare earth elements. So does your laptop, your electric car, the wind turbines generating clean energy, the fighter jets defending your country. All of it depends on a group of materials called rare earth elements, and Greenland is sitting on one of the largest untapped deposits on Earth, the Kvanefjeld deposit, a geopolitical game-changer. In southern Greenland, there's a site called Kvanefjeld. Geological surveys estimate it contains over 1 million metric tons of rare earth oxides. That includes neodymium and dysprosium, the materials that make high-performance magnets for electric motors and missile guidance systems. To put that in perspective, a single F-35 fighter jet requires hundreds of pounds of rare earth materials. One Virginia-class submarine needs even more. Without rare earths, modern militaries literally cannot function. China's stranglehold on the supply chain. Here's the nightmare keeping Pentagon strategists awake at night. China controls 80 to 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. Even when rare earths are mined in Australia, the United States, or Africa, they usually get shipped to China for refining, because China spent decades building the infrastructure, accepting the environmental costs, and dominating the market. If Beijing ever decides to restrict exports, and they've done it before during trade disputes, Western manufacturing grinds to a halt. Defense contractors can't build missiles. Auto companies can't build electric vehicles. Wind farms can't expand. Greenland represents one of the only realistic paths to breaking that dependency. While America laughed, China moved. Here's the part that should make you angry. While American media was making memes about Trump wanting to buy Greenland, a Chinese mining company called Shenghe Resources quietly acquired a major stake in the company that holds development rights to Kvanefjeld. Let that sink in. China now has significant influence over one of the world's most strategic rare earth deposits, and they didn't fire a single shot or make a single threatening statement. They just wrote a check. It becomes sovereign U.S. territory, a permanently hardened forward defense zone.
Project Iceworm, the military base you were never supposed to know about. Let me tell you a story that sounds like science fiction,
but is 100% real. In 1959, the U.S. Army arrived in Greenland with a cover story. They told Denmark they were building a research station to study ice cores and Arctic weather. Harmless science stuff. What they actually built was Camp Century, a small city carved into the glacier. It had living quarters for 200 personnel, a hospital, a chapel, a movie theater, laboratories, and a portable nuclear reactor to power it all. The public story was research. The real mission was called Project Iceworm, the plan to hide 600 nuclear missiles under the ice. Here's what the Pentagon actually wanted to do. Carve thousands of miles of tunnels through the Greenland ice sheet, store 600 nuclear missiles underground, mount them on rail systems so they'd constantly move through the tunnel network. Soviet satellites wouldn't be able to track them. Even if the USSR launched a first strike, they couldn't destroy what they couldn't find. It was brilliant, it was insane, and it almost worked. There was just one problem. Ice moves. Engineers underestimated how aggressively glaciers deform. Tunnel walls warped, ceilings shifted. Maintenance became impossible. By 1967, the Pentagon quietly abandoned Camp Century. The toxic time bomb. Here's where it gets ugly. When the U.S. abandoned Camp Century, they removed the nuclear reactor core, but they left behind tens of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, PCB-contaminated waste, sewage, low-level radioactive materials. The assumption was simple. The ice will stay frozen forever. This waste will be buried for millennia. That assumption is now in serious doubt. As Arctic temperatures rise, scientists warn that parts of Camp Century could thaw. That means toxic waste potentially leaching into ecosystems. Denmark is understandably furious. Greenland's government feels betrayed, and the U.S. is facing a cleanup bill that could run into hundreds of millions of dollars. Pitifik Space Base, the real reason America can never leave. Today, the U.S. military presence in Greenland is less secret but far more critical. Pitifik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, sits in northwest Greenland. It's the northernmost U.S. military installation on Earth. It hosts the 12th Space Warning Squadron and operates powerful radar systems that scan for ballistic missile launches over the polar routes. If North Korea, Russia, or China ever launches ICMs toward North America, Pitifik sees them first. Without access to this base, America's early warning network would have a massive blind spot over the Arctic. From Washington's perspective, owning Greenland wouldn't just be convenient, it would permanently secure one of the most critical pieces of missile defense on the planet.
The routes that didn't exist 20 years ago. Here's the darkest irony of the 21st century. Climate change is destroying the planet, but it's also creating the most valuable shipping lanes in human history. For thousands of years, the Arctic Ocean was a frozen barrier. If you wanted to ship goods from Shanghai to Rotterdam, you sailed south through the Suez Canal. That journey takes 30 to 40 days. But as Arctic ice melts, new routes are opening. The Northern Sea Route along Russia's coast can cut that journey by 10 to 15 days. That's a 25 to 35% reduction in transit time. Fuel savings alone translate into billions of dollars annually for shipping companies. In the future, an even more direct path, the Trans-Polar Sea Route cutting straight across the central Arctic, may become viable. Greenland, the toll booth of the future. Greenland sits at the gateway of these emerging routes. Whoever builds the ports, refueling hubs, repair facilities, and rescue infrastructure controls access. Russia is already charging transit fees and escort costs for ships using the Northern Sea Route. China calls its Arctic strategy the Polar Silk Road. Beijing sees this as a way to bypass vulnerable choke points like the Suez Canal and diversify trade routes into Europe. But here's the problem.
Greenland doesn't have the infrastructure. There are almost no deep-water ports, limited emergency facilities, minimal logistics support. Building it requires massive capital investment. If Denmark can't afford it and the U.S. doesn't step in, someone else will. And the country walking around with the world's biggest infrastructure checkbook is China. The geopolitical chess match. Owning Greenland wouldn't give the U.S. control over international waters, but it would give enormous influence over port development, logistics hubs, search and rescue operations, security infrastructure, and commercial licensing. Basically, you become the landlord of the Arctic economy. So when you hear about melting glaciers, don't just think about polar bears and rising sea levels. Think about new trade routes worth trillions. Think about who controls the ports, and think about the quiet race to decide who collects the tolls.
The financial reality nobody talks about. Now we get to the real strategy, the 4D chess that Washington is actually playing. Greenland already governs itself in most ways. It has its own flag, its own language, but foreign policy and defense are controlled by Denmark, nearly 2,000 miles away in Copenhagen. Polls consistently show that 60 to 80% of Greenlanders support independence. The dream of sovereignty is real, but there's a brutal financial reality. Every year, Denmark sends Greenland a block grant of about $600 million USD. That single payment covers more than half of Greenland's public budget. It pays for hospitals, schools, infrastructure, police, and social services. Without that money, the economy would collapse overnight. You can't afford to be free. Here's the trap. Greenland cannot currently afford to be independent unless someone replaces Denmark's subsidy. And that's where the strategy shifts from buying land to buying influence. If Greenland votes for independence, Denmark's subsidy disappears. The new government would desperately need replacement funding. Whoever steps in first with money, investment, and security guarantees becomes the most important partner in the country. The quiet American expansion. The U.S. is already laying groundwork. In 2020, America reopened a consulate in GIUK for the first time since the 1950s. Alongside it came a $12.1 million aid package for infrastructure and business development. Denmark publicly welcomed the move, but privately officials were clearly nervous about Washington establishing a permanent presence in what has long been Copenhagen's backyard. It's the geopolitical equivalent of your ex's new partner saying, "You don't need them anymore, I can take care of you." The Chinese alternative. And here's the risk. If the U.S. hesitates, China is ready. Beijing offers infrastructure financing with fewer political strings attached. They don't lecture about human rights or democratic reforms. They just write checks. We've seen this playbook before. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port leased to China for 99 years after debt default. Djibouti, China's first overseas military base. Pakistan's Gwadar port, operational control transferred to Chinese companies. The pattern is clear. Infrastructure debt becomes strategic leverage. So the real race isn't to buy Greenland, it's to become the preferred partner of a future independent Greenland. What's the Zillow estimate for an entire country? Let's play the most absurd game of real estate valuation in history. You're trying to price 836,000 square miles of ice, rock, rare earth deposits, and military dominance. Where do you even start? Historical comparisons. When Truman offered $100 million in 1946, that's about $1.6 billion in today's money. That's insultingly low. Facebook paid more for Instagram. When analysts tried to model this in 2019, some estimates pushed toward $1 trillion, depending on assumptions about mineral wealth and strategic value. The Alaska model. We bought Alaska for roughly $129 million in today's dollars, about 2 cents per acre. If you applied that logic to Greenland, the price would be laughably low,
But the geopolitical market has changed since 1867. The real valuation. Treating Greenland as a strategic sovereign asset with massive upside, realistic valuations range from $200 billion to $500 billion before counting mineral deposits. To put that in perspective, $500 billion is roughly what the U.S. spends annually just servicing national debt interest. It's less than the F-35 program development cost. It's comparable to Tesla's market cap at its peak. For the price of one Elon Musk company, the United States could theoretically secure Arctic dominance for generations. The hidden costs. But here's what breaks the calculator. You're not just buying land, you're buying a society. Greenland's 57,000 residents would likely gain U.S. territorial status and eventual citizenship. They'd be entitled to federal health care programs, Social Security, infrastructure upgrades, and education funding. And the infrastructure bill would be astronomical. Greenland has no roads between cities. You literally cannot drive from one town to another. Everything moves by air or boat. Bringing that up to modern standards would cost trillions over decades. So the purchase price is just the down payment. The renovation costs would dwarf it. The alternative cost. But supporters make a compelling argument. What's the cost of losing Arctic dominance? What's the cost of China controlling North Atlantic access? What's the cost of losing the materials race that powers defense technology? What's the cost of Russian submarines operating freely in the GIUK Gap? Suddenly, $1 trillion doesn't sound insane. The wounds that never healed. While Washington, Beijing, and Copenhagen play strategic games on maps, the people actually living in Greenland are fighting a very different kind of war. This is the part of the story that should make you deeply uncomfortable. The Little Danes experiment. In 1951, Denmark launched a social experiment that still haunts the country. They forcibly removed 22 Inuit children from their families. Some were orphans, many were not. They sent these children to Denmark with a mission: culturally modernize them, teach them Danish, erase their native language, turn them into model citizens who would return and help reshape Greenland in Denmark's image. It was social engineering disguised as education. When the children eventually returned, many no longer spoke their own language. They felt alien in their own communities. Several struggled with addiction, depression, and early death. Family lines were shattered. In 2022, Denmark formally apologized and offered compensation, but you can't apologize away generational trauma. The episode left deep distrust of foreign powers promising to help. The silent epidemic. Walk through GIUK or smaller settlements, and you'll see posters that say, "The call is free, no one is alone." They're not advertising a phone plan, they're advertising suicide prevention hotlines. Greenland has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, especially among young men. The combination of long winter darkness, historical trauma, geographic isolation, rapid cultural change, and limited mental health services has created a quiet crisis that touches nearly every family. When politicians casually talk about buying Greenland, they're not talking about empty land. They're talking about a population that is hurting, resilient, and deeply sensitive to being treated like a commodity. The vanishing culture. For thousands of years, the Inuit hunter and the sled dog were inseparable. You couldn't survive the Arctic without dogs. Today, that bond is breaking. As sea ice forms later and melts earlier, traditional hunting seasons have collapsed. Without reliable hunting, feeding sled dogs becomes economically impossible. Imported dog food is prohibitively expensive in remote areas. Some hunters have been forced into heartbreaking decisions, euthanizing dogs they can no longer support. Over the past 2 decades, Greenland's sled dog population has declined by 40 to 50%. It's a visceral symbol of a culture caught between two worlds, the old Arctic way of life fading and the promised new economy of shipping and mining still not fully arriving.
From joke to national security priority. If you thought this story was just about a weird 2019 tweet, you haven't been paying attention. What started as diplomatic awkwardness has escalated into serious strategic brinksmanship. In early January 2026, the White House confirmed that President Trump and his national security team are actively exploring options for securing Greenland. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said in a briefing that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option. Let that sink in. A NATO ally, a peaceful democracy, and American officials are publicly discussing military options. The international response. Denmark immediately reaffirmed that Greenland is not sold and that its sovereignty must be respected. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and European leaders warned that any use of force would undermine the entire post-World War II international order. France, Germany, and Canada publicly supported Greenland's sovereignty and warned that coercive action would severely strain NATO. What's actually happening? To be clear, the U.S. has not mobilized invasion forces. Denmark has not consented to any transfer. What has changed is the tone. This has gone from a sidelined idea to a stated national security priority, cited in the context of Arctic competition with Russia and China. Some U.S. lawmakers frame the rhetoric as negotiating pressure, not a genuine invasion threat. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized that the goal remains diplomatic resolution, though he notably hasn't ruled out force entirely. The unprecedented moment. We're watching a geopolitical escalation that hasn't been seen between Western allies in decades. The stakes are immense. Strategic access to the Arctic, control of rare earth minerals, shipping route dominance, the future of a territory under Danish sovereignty for over 300 years. Whether this evolves into actual conflict or returns to diplomacy remains uncertain, but for the first time in generations, the tone is unmistakably serious. The map is changing. For 500 years, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of global power. For the last 50 years, it was the Pacific. But the next 50 years will be decided in the Arctic. Greenland is the cork in the bottle. It holds the minerals that power modern technology, the radar systems that defend North America, the gateway to new ocean routes reshaping global trade. The competing visions. The United States sees Greenland as a shield, a defensive barrier protecting North America from threats across the polar region. China sees it as a battery, a source of critical materials and a logistics hub for Arctic shipping. Denmark sees it as a responsibility, a legacy territory it must protect while respecting Greenlandic autonomy. And the Greenlanders? They mostly just want stability, dignity, and a future where their children can thrive. The question nobody's asking. The real question isn't whether Greenland will become more valuable. It absolutely will. The question is, how does the world handle that value? With diplomacy, with investment, with economic leverage, or eventually with force? The ice is melting. As the glaciers recede, they're revealing something far more dangerous than the land beneath. They're revealing human greed, strategic desperation, and the uncomfortable truth that in geopolitics, almost nothing is off the table.
The story of Greenland isn't really about ice or minerals or military bases. It's about what happens when the climate changes the rules of the game. It's about what happens when strategic scarcity meets great power competition. And it's about the people caught in the middle when their home becomes the most valuable piece of real estate nobody knew existed. The ice is melting, the race is on, and the world is watching. Thanks for watching. If this opened your eyes to how geography shapes power, hit that subscribe button. Next video, we're diving into the Monroe Doctrine and what happens when superpowers decide they own your backyard. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay warm out there.